In our second episode of the University of Washington Taiwan Studies YouTube series on the richness and diversity of research in Taiwan, we're back with Professor Rovaniyaw from the Department of Indigenous Studies and Indigenous and Development Studies at Donghua University in Hualien, and talking about, last time we talked a lot about the general background of indigenous people in Taiwan, and particularly about indigenous research and education. Professor Rovaniyaw is, of course, a researcher herself, and we're going to ask her to talk a little bit about the kind of projects that she's doing. So can you describe some of the major research projects that you have done, not just now, but through your career, particularly as an anthropologist and as a psychiatric and as an environmental anthropologist?
Okay, maybe I will start from my PhD projects. My PhD dissertation targets the very controversy on the selection of nuclear waste sites in Taiwan, adopting the environmental anthropology perspective to discuss how the colonial history and the changes in modern society that the indigenous people have experienced influence the people-land relationship and even eventually shape the indigenous people's attitude toward the nuclear waste. In recent 2 years, when I'm back from UW to Taiwan to teach, as one of few indigenous scholars with nursing and anthropology training, I was invited to participate in a research team focusing on the long-term care of indigenous elders and exploring how to define the cultural competence of health providers, as well as the cultural authenticity presented in the healthcare field. Through the 2-year projects, I hope the research conclusions could help to create a respectful space and place for indigenous elders.
You told me last time we talked about 2 projects that you were just starting on Lanyu, Orchid Island, and I believe you were doing some field work this summer. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about those 2 projects.
With my psychiatric nursing and environmental anthropological training, I attempt to incorporate the concept of environmental healing into healthcare service, as well as the concept of holistic wellness into environmental sustainability development. As of right now, I'm conducting the research project of the well-living, well-being, and sustainable development goals for Bonsonadawu, which means Lanyu or Orchid Island. The main idea centers around my fieldwork site and the issue of Lanyu's waste. The official subject is the changing cultural concept of waste in Bonsonadawu. Yep.
I saw a picture of the very pretty front of some restaurants and tourist sites, and then you had a picture of the back alley, and it was all just piled with junk. What does this tell us in a preliminary way about the cultural concept of waste?
I think the waste doesn't exist in the past traditional indigenous life, especially in Lanyu, because they really lack of the food and any living supplies. So to them, there's no waste in their daily life. But when the plastic garbage came to the Lanyu, the plastic garbage become a big issue. But it's actually in the beginning of the plastic garbage coming to the island, they treat these plastic items from other country or from the Pacific Ocean wave. They call it like they treat it like a gift because it's very special and they don't have these special items. But when the tourism industry very hot in this island, the garbage become overwhelming. So it's become an environmental issue in Lanyu. So now we are trying to find a pathway to deal with the plastic garbage in this island and maybe create some policies with local Dao peoples.
How do you involve students in your research? Have you involved graduate students, undergraduate students? How do you do that?
Okay. The courses I offer include medical anthropology, social psychology, ecological and health, and indigenous social work, and the related courses. The graduate students I have supervised are mainly study in the area of social work and the professional health care in the indigenous community. From I think from lessons in school, they start to pay attention to the neglect of special qualities of indigenous communities in past mainstream social work education. In addition, they also choose their these subjects on current indigenous long-term care, cultural competence, and the related issues. There has also been research on how indigenous teams can get involved with cultural care through the system of social welfare and the investigations on how to use like the green care in indigenous areas. These green care use methods such as horticultural therapy, ecological healing, to build a foundation of using indigenous culture in care system based on subjectivity.
Now, this is a difficult question, but really, I've been asking you difficult questions for 10 years now. How do you integrate the ideas that come out of psychology, social work, psychiatry, nursing, all of which are not even native to Taiwan, mostly inherited from Euro-American traditions, and then native ideas about mental health. They may not use that word mental health, but sanity, care, how to care for people. How do these things fit together? How do you avoid just imposing something on a native community? How do you involve indigenous ideas in these projects?
Yeah, I think if you are interested in the indigenous communities work, you will find that when you get into the community, we call it 部落 tribe. Someone says tribe, or I think it's called a community is better. So when you get into the indigenous community, there's no, the discipline, different discipline for the indigenous people. You are a person, you are a human, you are a man or woman to come into my community. So they don't care you are a social worker, you are a nurse, or you are an anthropologist. They just know what are you doing, what you want to do to us or for us. So I think even though I have a nursing background and anthropology background, and now I'm doing the social work teaching and the research, for me it's all about the human centered. profession. So if the indigenous is our target, is all our subject to serve, I try to find a way to cross the different disciplines. So we need to think about the indigenous subjectivity, how they feel, how they like or how they want. So I try to like the social work they call the green care, or the nursing say the well-being, and environmental anthropologists say the sustainability development. But for me, in indigenous environment, indigenous our daily life, those environment, human, culture, land is all uh, work together, and they cannot be separated. So I think when I say if you want the indigenous happy or get the well-being or feel happiness, you have give them a very health, very clear environment. And for indigenous people, I think like the ecological healing or the psychological environment, they neglect the indigenous feeling, indigenous culture. When they do their land care, they are not just for get some benefits from the land, from the ecology. They also benefit from their ancestor spirit in their land. So I think that's a more meaning in the environment healing for indigenous people. So now I try to do those like my course I offered in the seminar on the ecology and the health. I try to connect each other, that different discipline, different professions, to see the indigenous health, indigenous well-being. That's very complicated, and not just for the environment, not just for the psychology or psychiatric perspective. They can put together and more cultural meaning in this process.
What's the role of the Christian church in all this? Almost all indigenous people in Taiwan belong to one or another Christian church, some Catholic, some Presbyterian, some Seventh-day Adventist, and so on. How does that fit in with these holistic ideas of well-being?
Mm-hmm. Like I think the Christian, the belief really changed a lot from because the Christian belief system came into indigenous community. I think the indigenous people try to cooperate and try to find a way to cooperate each other. And when I see most in like the Tao woman, they do their water taro field care. They try to pray for the gods to protect their land, but also they try to sing a song to appreciate the ancestor, to give them the taro seeds, a good taro seed too, and then they try to save more better seed, taro seed, to their offsprings, their next generations. So for me, the gods and the ancestor or the land of spirits can go together in their daily life. They try to get more different mental support from different spirit or from different sources.
This has been really interesting, I think, and I think that our viewers will learn a lot from it. And I want to wind up by asking you a couple of general questions.
Mm-hmm.
One is, if you were to do this interview in Mandarin on 中式华式, uh, uh, and uh, and you had only 5 minutes, uh, 5 minutes, what would be, or less. What would you want most Han Taiwanese people to know about indigenous communities? What are the two or three things that you think they really don't know and they should know?
Okay. Wow, it's hard to condense everything into 2 or 3 in 4 minutes. So many things I want to say to public. But if I had to choose only or maybe 3, it would be the following, I think. I think the first is please know and understand the structural violence and the social suffering underwanted by the Taiwanese indigenous people. This is an act of historical justice. The second I want to say is please respect the unique aspect of Taiwanese indigenous culture. Every culture is beautiful, and so they should have their own cultural sovereignty. The last one I want to say in public is please appreciate the cultural resilience of Taiwanese indigenous groups and use this to find a path for both indigenous and non-indigenous people to prosper and live together in harmony. Yeah.
And finally, you had a whole career as a psychiatric nurse, and now you're just a few years into your career as no longer a student, but now a teacher and researcher as an anthropologist. So you have a few decades left. When you retire at age 65 or 70 or whatever, if you can imagine that, what would you hope to have accomplished as an indigenous scholar or as an anthropologist in Taiwan society or worldwide?
I hope I can use the perspective of nursing care and environmental anthropology as a foundation to work on indigenous ecological community, environment, culture, and health as a good method to find a way for indigenous communities.
Well, thank you very much. We are honored to have had Professor Rovaniyaw, also known as Zhang, as our guest tonight, and I hope that listeners on our Taiwan Studies YouTube channel will learn something and will be inspired to go on and learn more about the inspiring work of indigenous scholars and indigenous studies in Taiwan. So thank you again, and good night, everybody.
Thank you for having me for your interview. Thank you. Bye. Masalu. 多谢。